While most imagine Africa's future shaped by new leaders or outside powers, Gaddafi's ghost is shifting the continent's destiny toward a dramatic crossroads of unity or fragmentation right now. Reports show that beneath the surface, alliances are being tested, resources are being renegotiated, and the very idea of African sovereignty is up for grabs. What if, on January 16, 2026, Muammar Gaddafi himself stepped back onto Libyan soil? Would his return ignite a new era of continental power or plunge Africa into deeper turmoil? Before we go any further, I want to speak directly to you. If you're watching this, you're someone who values depth over noise and real analysis over empty headlines. But these stories, these investigations, only reach the people who need them if you help us. By subscribing, liking, or sharing right now, you're not just supporting a channel, you're joining a movement to amplify Africa's true narrative and ensure these vital conversations don't get drowned out. Your action today helps build a community that demands nuance, truth, and respect for the forces shaping our world. So take a moment, join us, and let's make sure the future of Africa is told by those who care most. Let's begin by stepping back and understanding the man at the center of this hypothetical storm. Muammar Gaddafi, for decades, was more than just Libya's ruler. He was a self-styled architect of a united Africa, a figure whose ambitions extended far beyond his country's borders. To some, he was a visionary, to others, a destabilizing force. But what made Gaddafi unique was his relentless pursuit of Pan-Africanism, a vision that, even in his absence, continues to haunt the continent's political imagination. Gaddafi's original blueprint was audacious. He called for the creation of a United States of Africa, a single currency, a unified passport, and a continent-wide military force. He wanted to erase colonial borders, dissolve the barriers that divided African nations, and forge a new political and economic identity. His vision was not just about symbolism. He poured Libya's oil wealth into African Union initiatives, bankrolled peacekeeping missions, and lobbied for the transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union itself. At the 1999 Sirte Summit, he formally outlined his ambitions, urging leaders to imagine a borderless Africa, defended by its own army and governed by its own institutions. But Gaddafi's vision was always controversial. Many African leaders saw his proposals as premature, even reckless. The continent, fractured by ethnic, religious, and linguistic divides, was still struggling to consolidate national identities, let alone continental ones. The African Union, while embracing the rhetoric of unity, often recoiled from Gaddafi's more radical ideas. His push for a single African government was repeatedly rebuffed, with critics citing the continent's lack of readiness for such integration and the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of one man or one state. Yet for all the resistance, Gaddafi's influence was undeniable. He positioned Libya as a continental power, using oil revenues to buy influence and support. He intervened militarily in neighboring countries, sometimes under the banner of Pan-African solidarity, other times to advance Libya's strategic interests. His rule was marked by centralized economic control, radical political experiments, and a relentless campaign to reshape Africa's destiny. To truly grasp the stakes of Gaddafi's hypothetical return, we need to explore the Africa he left behind and the one that exists today. Since his ouster in 2011, Libya has been plagued by instability, factionalism, and a weakened state apparatus. Rival militias, foreign interventions, and competing governments have left Libya deeply divided and vulnerable. The prospect of Gaddafi reclaiming power or even simply re-entering the political arena would ignite fierce debates and potentially violent confrontations. His supporters would hail him as a savior, while his opponents would mobilize to prevent a return to the past. But the shockwaves would not stop at Libya's borders. The African Union would face an existential test. Historically, the AU has struggled to address major crises and divisive figures, often lacking robust leadership and consistent implementation of its rules and norms. The organization's credibility as Africa's premier peace and security body has been challenged by its responses to internal conflicts, coups, and human rights abuses. The return of Gaddafi, a leader who once challenged the AU's very foundations, would force the organization to confront its own limitations and redefine its role in shaping the continent's future. The reactions of key regional powers would be critical. Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, has recently cracked down on Pan-Africanist gatherings, signaling a complex relationship with the movement. South Africa, with its history of Pan-Africanist leadership, faces its own internal challenges, including upcoming pivotal elections and ongoing political instability. Egypt and Ethiopia, both regional heavyweights, would weigh their own interests against the prospect of a renewed continental agenda. The effectiveness of any Pan-Africanist initiative would depend not just on elite support, but on the ability to mobilize the broader African population, a task that has historically proven elusive. Africa's demographic landscape has also shifted dramatically. The continent is now home to the world's youngest population, with 70% of sub-Saharan Africans under the age of 30. This demographic shift is not just a statistic, it's a force that is reshaping politics, economies, and societies from Cairo to Cape Town. African youth are more connected, more politically engaged, and more determined to claim their future than ever before. Yet, despite their numbers, youth representation in political offices remains low, with the median age of leaders hovering around 62. This generational gap fuels both frustration and activism, as young Africans demand a seat at the table and a voice in shaping their country's destinies. Economically, Africa is at a crossroads. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2021, has begun to break down barriers to intra-African trade, creating new opportunities for growth and development. Reports indicate that increased trade connectivity is driving job creation, building more resilient economies, and promoting inclusive growth. Yet, the old challenges persist. Many African nations remain dependent on exporting raw materials, often under the control of foreign corporations. The legacy of colonialism continues to shape investment laws, trade agreements, and development policies, prioritizing resource extraction over local development. Public debt has nearly doubled in the past decade, with half of African countries now facing debt distress. The influence of international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank remains strong, often resulting in cycles of debt, austerity, and economic dependency. Against this backdrop, the presence of new external actors has complicated the picture. China, in particular, has become sub-Saharan Africa's largest bilateral trading partner, accounting for about 20% of the region's exports and 16% of its imports. Chinese investments have fueled infrastructure development, reduced transport costs, and expanded productive capacity across the continent. But this engagement is not without controversy. While some African countries have benefited from Chinese-backed projects, others have become entangled in debt and dependency. China's growing influence has also shifted the geopolitical balance, challenging traditional Western dominance and creating new opportunities and risks for African states. Other emerging powers, such as Russia and Turkey, are also seeking footholds in Africa, leveraging strategic partnerships to build economic and political influence. The rise of BRICS Plus, a loose coalition of non-Western economies, including China, India, Russia, and several African states, offers African countries alternatives to traditional Western alliances. This multi-alignment strategy allows African leaders to diversify their diplomatic and economic options, but it also introduces new complexities and potential sources of conflict. So, what would happen if Gaddafi returned to this transformed landscape? Would his Pan-Africanist vision find new life, or would it collapse under the weight of past failures and new realities? To answer this, we need to examine the core dilemma at the heart of his hypothetical return: unity or fragmentation. On one hand, Gaddafi's return could reignite the dream of continental unity. His original blueprint, political federation, economic integration, and collective resource control remains compelling in a world where Africa's potential is often constrained by external actors and internal divisions. The idea of a unified Africa, capable of negotiating from a position of strength and asserting its sovereignty on the global stage, is as relevant today as it was 2 decades ago. Recent data shows that deeper interdependence among African nations could build trust, institutional capacity, and economic resilience, helping to stabilize global commodity markets and drive worldwide economic recovery. But the obstacles to unity are formidable. Africa's immense ethnic and religious diversity, shaped by centuries of colonialism and internal conflict, continues to undermine efforts at political integration. Ethnic and religious divisions have fueled violence, displacement, and instability across the continent. Politicized ethnicity remains a major source of domestic conflict, complicating efforts to build inclusive, democratic institutions. The struggle for national unity in countries like Nigeria is a constant reminder of the challenges facing any project of continental integration. Moreover, Gaddafi's own legacy is deeply divisive. While some remember him as a champion of African independence and self-determination, others recall his interventions in neighboring countries, his authoritarian rule, and his willingness to use force to achieve his goals. The African Union, which has struggled to address internal crises and divisive figures in the past, would face a profound dilemma: embrace a leader who challenged its established structures or reject him as a relic of a bygone era. Resource control would be another flashpoint. Gaddafi's past focus on African sovereignty over natural resources would clash with current extraction agreements and established global supply chains. Many African nations view control over their resources as essential for economic independence, but renegotiating these deals would be fraught with political and economic risks. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement aims to increase financial oversight and local control, but overcoming the colonial development model remains a daunting challenge. External influence would also come under scrutiny. A resurgent, unified African bloc, potentially under Gaddafi's theoretical guidance, would pose a direct challenge to the entrenched interests of the IMF, World Bank, and former colonial powers. The prospect of Africa asserting greater control over its economic policies and resources would force a re-evaluation of strategies by the United States, European Union, and Russia. Economic realignment could disrupt global trade routes, energy markets, and investment flows, with far-reaching consequences for the world economy. At the same time, the rise of China and other emerging powers would complicate Gaddafi's anti-imperialist rhetoric. While he historically distrusted Western influence, the pervasive presence of China in Africa today would require a new approach. Chinese investments have brought both opportunities and challenges, and African leaders are increasingly adept at leveraging multiple partnerships to advance their interests. The growing influence of BRICS Plus and other non-Western alliances offers African states new avenues for cooperation, but also new sources of competition and tension. To understand the full implications of Gaddafi's hypothetical return, we need to look beyond the headlines and examine the deeper currents shaping Africa's geopolitical future. The continent is at a crossroads, caught between the promise of unity and the reality of fragmentation. The choices made in the coming years will determine whether Africa can realize its potential as a global powerhouse or remain mired in cycles of conflict and dependency. Let's take a closer look at the immediate ripple effects that Gaddafi's return would trigger across Africa and beyond. The mere announcement of his presence on Libyan soil would send shockwaves through regional capitals and global chancelleries. Leaders would scramble to assess the implications for their own positions, alliances, and interests. Some might see an opportunity to revive Pan-Africanist ideals and challenge external domination. Others would fear a resurgence of authoritarianism, instability, and conflict. In Libya itself, Gaddafi's return would be nothing short of seismic. Since his ouster, the country has experienced a vacuum of authority, with rival factions vying for control and foreign actors exploiting the chaos. The re-emergence of such a polarizing figure could either galvanize a movement for national unity or plunge the country into renewed violence. The outcome would depend on how Libyan society, now shaped by years of conflict and shifting alliances, responds to the specter of its former leader. Beyond Libya, the African Union would be thrust into the spotlight. The AU has long struggled to balance the ideals of unity and sovereignty with the practical realities of divergent national interests. Gaddafi's return would force the organization to confront its own contradictions should it welcome a leader who once championed African unity or distance itself from a figure whose methods and legacy remain deeply contested. The AU's response would set a precedent for how Africa deals with controversial leaders and the broader question of continental governance. Regional power brokers would quickly stake out their positions. Nigeria, with its complex relationship to Pan-Africanism, might adopt a cautious or even repressive stance, wary of any movement that threatens national sovereignty or stability. South Africa, long a champion of continental cooperation, would weigh the risks and rewards of aligning with Gaddafi's agenda. Egypt and Ethiopia, both with their own regional ambitions, would seek to protect their interests and influence the direction of any renewed push for unity. The reactions of Africa's youth would be particularly significant. With the median age on the continent just 19, young people are both the drivers and the victims of political change. Their engagement in electoral and non-electoral activities, their demands for representation and accountability, and their willingness to challenge the status quo would shape the trajectory of any Pan-Africanist movement. The question is whether Gaddafi's vision, rooted in the politics of a previous era, could resonate with a new generation that is more connected, more informed, and more impatient for change. At the same time, the influence of external actors will loom large. China's economic presence, Russia's strategic partnerships, and Turkey's growing involvement all complicate the calculus for African leaders. The decline of Western influence, coupled with the rise of BRICS Plus and other Global South alliances, creates new opportunities for multi-alignment and diplomatic maneuvering. African states are increasingly adept at playing external powers off against each other, extracting concessions and advancing their own interests. But this game is fraught with risks, including the danger of becoming pawns in larger geopolitical struggles. Resource control would be a central battleground. The history of foreign extraction agreements, shaped by colonial-era treaties and international investment laws, has left many African countries dependent on exporting raw materials. Recent years have seen a push for greater local control, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement aiming to increase financial oversight and promote sustainable development. But renegotiating existing deals would be a complex and contentious process with powerful interests at stake. The involvement of foreign actors, whether Chinese, Russian, or Western, adds another layer of complexity as each seeks to protect its own access to Africa's vast resources. The impact of international financial institutions cannot be ignored. The IMF and World Bank have played a central role in shaping Africa's economic policies, often through loans, debt relief, and required development plans. While these interventions have sometimes produced short-term benefits, such as reduced inflation and balanced budgets, they have also contributed to cycles of debt and dependency. Many African countries remain classified as low income, with high rates of poverty and unemployment. Food production levels are still 20% below what is needed, despite population growth and international support. The challenge is to break free from these cycles and build a more sustainable, inclusive model of development. The question of unity versus fragmentation is not just theoretical, it has real-world consequences for Africa's future. A unified Africa could become an economic powerhouse, significantly impacting global trade, energy, and investment flows. Continental integration would enhance exports, build institutional capacity, and promote economic resilience. Stronger commitments to fiscal discipline, infrastructure development, and inclusive governance would be essential for realizing this potential. But the risks of fragmentation are equally real. Internal conflicts, ethnic and religious divisions, and the persistence of authoritarianism could undermine efforts at integration and leave the continent vulnerable to external manipulation. Observers note that the international community is watching closely. A shift toward greater African unity would force a re-evaluation of strategies by the United States, European Union, and Russia. Economic realignment could disrupt established trade routes, energy markets, and investment flows, with ripple effects across the global economy. The rise of a truly independent African bloc would challenge the entrenched interests of former colonial powers and international institutions, potentially ushering in a new era of global competition and cooperation. But the path forward is anything but certain. The legacy of colonialism, the persistence of internal divisions, and the influence of external actors all complicate the quest for unity. The challenge is to build institutions that are inclusive, accountable, and responsive to the needs of Africa's diverse populations. This requires not just visionary leadership, but broad-based participation and a willingness to confront difficult truths. Let's pause for a moment and reflect on the deeper implications of this hypothetical scenario. Gaddafi's return would not simply be a matter of one man reclaiming power. It would represent a test of Africa's capacity to define its own future, to assert its sovereignty, and to build institutions that can withstand the pressures of both internal and external forces. The stakes are high, not just for Africa, but for the world. As we move deeper into this exploration, let's examine the historical context that shaped Gaddafi's Pan-Africanist vision. Libya, under Gaddafi, became one of Africa's wealthiest states following the discovery of oil in 1959. Gaddafi used this wealth to expand Libya's influence, promoting Pan-Africanism and attempting to position himself as a continental leader. After being rebuffed by Arab leaders, he shifted his focus to Africa, using oil revenues to buy influence and support his grandiose visions. His interventions in neighboring countries, such as the invasions of Chad in the 1970s and 1980s, were often justified as efforts to promote stability and unity, but they also served Libya's strategic interests. Gaddafi's rule was marked by radical political programs and centralized economic control. He claimed to practice a form of direct democracy, but in reality he maintained strict control over all political power for more than 4 decades. His efforts to reshape Libya's role in Africa were both ambitious and controversial, earning him both admirers and detractors across the continent. The transformation of the Organization of African Unity into the African Union was one of Gaddafi's most significant achievements. He lobbied tirelessly for the creation of new institutions, including a single African army and a unified currency. He funded peacekeeping missions, supported liberation movements, and sought to position Libya as a leader in the struggle for African independence. But his vision was always tempered by the realities of a continent divided by history, geography, and competing interests. Today, the African Union faces its own set of challenges. The organization has shifted from the principle of non-interference to a policy of non-indifference regarding human rights abuses. It has struggled to address internal political dilemmas, including civilian and constitutional coups, and has often been criticized for lacking robust leadership. The AU's commitment to human rights and democratic governance is real, but implementation remains inconsistent. Leadership vacuums and recurring crises have perpetuated a narrative of a continent in crisis, highlighting the persistent obstacles to peace and security. The reactions of key regional powers to Pan-Africanist initiatives have been mixed. Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Egypt have all played significant roles in shaping the movement, but their responses have often reflected national interests rather than continental solidarity. Nigeria's recent crackdown on Pan-Africanist gatherings, including arrests at rallies, underscores the complexities of building unity in a context of competing priorities. South Africa's history of Pan-Africanist leadership is balanced by its own internal challenges, while Egypt and Ethiopia pursue their own regional agendas. The effectiveness of Pan-Africanist initiatives has often been limited by efforts to unite political elites rather than the broader population. The movement has had a lasting impact as an educational, political, and cultural force, but its successes and shortcomings remain the subject of ongoing debate. The challenge is to translate ideals into action, to build institutions that are both inclusive and effective, and to overcome the divisions that have long plagued the continent. The role of Africa's youth is central to this story. With 60% of the population under the age of 30, young people are both the future and the present of the continent. They are actively engaged in political and social movements, challenging established power structures and demanding greater representation. Yet their voices are often marginalized and their potential remains underutilized. The question is whether a renewed Pan-Africanist agenda could harness the energy and aspirations of Africa's youth, or whether it would remain the preserve of political elites. The rise of China and other emerging powers has added a new dimension to Africa's geopolitical landscape. Chinese investments have transformed infrastructure, expanded trade, and provided new sources of finance. But this engagement is not without controversy. Critics argue that Chinese-backed projects have increased debt burdens, undermined local industries, and created new forms of dependency. Supporters point to the tangible benefits of improved infrastructure, job creation, and economic growth. The reality is complex, with outcomes varying across countries and sectors. Russia and Turkey have also expanded their presence in Africa, leveraging strategic partnerships to build influence. The rise of BRICS+ offers African states new opportunities for cooperation and multi-alignment, but also introduces new sources of competition and tension. African leaders are increasingly adept at navigating this complex landscape, extracting concessions and advancing their own interests. But the risks of becoming entangled in larger geopolitical struggles are ever present. The question of resource control remains central to Africa's future. Historical extraction systems left many countries dependent on exporting raw materials, often under the control of foreign corporations. The legacy of colonialism continues to shape investment laws and trade agreements, prioritizing extraction over local development. Recent years have seen a push for greater local control, with the African Continental Free Trade Agreement aiming to increase financial oversight and promote sustainable development. But overcoming the colonial development model remains a daunting challenge. The impact of international financial institutions is another critical factor. The IMF and World Bank have played a central role in shaping Africa's economic policies, often through loans, debt relief, and required development plans. While these interventions have sometimes produced short-term benefits, such as reduced inflation and balanced budgets, they have also contributed to cycles of debt and dependency. Many African countries remain classified as low income, with high rates of poverty and unemployment. 2. Food production levels are still 20% below what is needed, despite population growth and international support. The challenge is to break free from these cycles and build a more sustainable, inclusive model of development. Observers note that the international community is watching closely. A shift toward greater African unity would force a re-evaluation of strategies by the United States, European Union, and Russia. Economic realignment could disrupt established trade routes, energy markets, and investment flows with ripple effects across the global economy. The rise of a truly independent African bloc would challenge the entrenched interests of former colonial powers and international institutions, potentially ushering in a new era of global competition and cooperation. But the path forward is anything but certain. The legacy of colonialism, the persistence of internal divisions, and the influence of external actors all complicate the quest for unity. The challenge is to build institutions that are inclusive, accountable, and responsive to the needs of Africa's diverse populations. This requires not just visionary leadership, but broad-based participation and a willingness to confront difficult truths. Let's now turn to the broader regional dynamics that would shape the continent's response to Gaddafi's return. West Africa, for example, is currently grappling with a wave of military coups and democratic backsliding. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea have experienced abrupt changes in leadership, often justified by promises of restoring order or fighting terrorism. Yet these transitions have frequently led to further instability, undermining regional cooperation and complicating efforts to build unified responses to security threats. In East Africa, the situation is equally complex. Ethiopia, once seen as a model of rapid economic growth and stability, has been mired in a devastating civil conflict that has drawn in neighboring states and strained regional alliances. The Horn of Africa remains a hotspot for external intervention, with Gulf states, Turkey, and China all vying for influence through port deals, infrastructure projects, and military partnerships. The region's strategic location along key maritime routes makes it a focal point for global competition, further complicating efforts to build lasting unity. Central Africa, meanwhile, continues to struggle with the legacy of protracted conflicts and weak state institutions. The Democratic Republic of Congo, despite its vast mineral wealth, remains plagued by violence, corruption, and humanitarian crises. Regional organizations like the Economic Community of Central African States have made some progress in mediating disputes, but the sheer scale of the challenges often overwhelms their capacity. Southern Africa presents a different set of dynamics. South Africa, the region's economic powerhouse, has long positioned itself as a champion of Pan-Africanism and continental integration. Yet the country faces its own internal challenges, including high unemployment, persistent inequality, and periodic outbreaks of xenophobic violence. Zimbabwe, Mozambique, and Angola each confront unique obstacles, from political repression to economic mismanagement and the lingering effects of civil war. North Africa, too, is undergoing significant transformation. Egypt, with its historical role as a leader in the Arab world and Africa, has sought to balance its regional ambitions with domestic pressures. The ongoing crisis in Sudan highlights the fragility of state institutions and the risks of external intervention. Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia each navigate their own paths, shaped by the legacies of colonialism, the Arab Spring, and shifting global alliances. Across these regions, the question of unity versus fragmentation is ever present. The African Union's ability to mediate conflicts, promote integration, and respond to crises is constantly tested by the divergent interests of its member states. The rise of regional economic communities such as ECOS, SADC, and EAC has created new opportunities for cooperation, but also new sources of competition and tension. Let's dig deeper into the economic dimensions of this story. Africa's resource wealth is both a blessing and a curse. The continent is home to vast reserves of oil, gas, minerals, and agricultural land. Yet the benefits of this wealth have often been captured by foreign corporations, local elites, or external powers. The so-called resource curse has fueled corruption, conflict, and underdevelopment, undermining efforts to build inclusive economies. Recent years have seen a growing push for resource nationalism. Countries like Tanzania and Zambia have sought to renegotiate mining contracts, increase local ownership, and capture a greater share of the value generated by their natural resources. The African Continental Free Trade Area represents a bold attempt to break the cycle of dependency, promote intra-African trade, and build more resilient economies. But the path is fraught with challenges, from entrenched interests to weak regulatory frameworks and limited infrastructure. The role of international financial institutions remains contentious. The IMF and World Bank have long promoted structural adjustment programs, fiscal discipline, and market liberalization as the keys to development. Yet these policies have often produced mixed results, with short-term gains offset by long-term social costs. Critics argue that the focus on debt repayment, austerity, and privatization has undermined public investment, weakened social safety nets, and perpetuated cycles of poverty and inequality. China's rise as a major economic partner has transformed the landscape. Chinese investments in infrastructure, energy, and manufacturing have created new opportunities for growth, but also new risks of dependency and debt distress. Reports indicate that Chinese-backed projects have helped strengthen state balance sheets in several African countries, but have also increased Western dependence on China for critical minerals. The shift from debt-fueled mega-projects to more selective investments reflects a broader recalibration of China's engagement in Africa. Russia and Turkey have also expanded their presence, leveraging strategic partnerships and security cooperation to build influence. The rise of BRICS Plus offers African states new avenues for cooperation, but also introduces new sources of competition and tension. African leaders are increasingly adept at navigating this complex landscape, extracting concessions and advancing their own interests. Let's bring in some specific examples to illustrate these dynamics. In Nigeria, the government's crackdown on Pan-Africanist gatherings reflects deep anxieties about national identity, sovereignty, and the risks of regional instability. The country's vast oil wealth has been both a source of power and a magnet for corruption, conflict, and external interference. Efforts to reform the oil sector, diversify the economy, and promote inclusive growth have met with mixed success, highlighting the challenges of translating resource wealth into broad-based development. In Ethiopia, the recent civil conflict has exposed the fragility of state institutions and the limits of regional cooperation. The government's efforts to balance ethnic federalism with national unity have been tested by competing interests, external pressures, and the demands of a rapidly growing population. The Horn of Africa's strategic location has attracted the attention of global powers, complicating efforts to build lasting peace and stability. South Africa's experience offers another perspective. The country's transition from apartheid to democracy was hailed as a model of reconciliation and inclusive governance. Yet, persistent inequality, high unemployment, and periodic outbreaks of violence have tested the resilience of its institutions. South Africa's role as a leader in the African Union and BRICS Plus reflects its ambitions for continental and global influence, but also the challenges of balancing domestic priorities with regional responsibilities. Let's not overlook the role of civil society, grassroots movements, and the private sector in shaping Africa's future. Across the continent, young entrepreneurs, activists, and innovators are driving change from the bottom up. The rise of digital technologies, mobile banking, and social media has created new opportunities for participation, accountability, and economic empowerment. Yet these gains are often threatened by censorship, repression, and the digital divide. Education, health, and social protection remain critical challenges. Many African countries continue to struggle with inadequate infrastructure, limited access to quality services, and high rates of poverty and unemployment. The COVID-19 pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities of health systems, disrupted education, and deepened existing inequalities. The recovery will require sustained investment, innovation, and cooperation at all levels. Let's return to the central question. Could Gaddafi's return tip the balance toward unity or fragmentation? The answer depends on a complex interplay of historical legacies, regional dynamics, economic interests, and global forces. Gaddafi's Africanist vision, while inspiring to some, remains deeply contested. The continent's diversity, resilience, and capacity for adaptation will ultimately determine its path. The stakes could not be higher. Africa's population is projected to double by 2050, reaching nearly 2.5 billion people. The continent will account for a growing share of the global workforce, consumer market, and innovation ecosystem. The choices made today about governance, resource management, regional integration, and external partnerships will shape the trajectory of the 21st century. Let's close by synthesizing what we've uncovered. The hypothetical return of Gaddafi is not just a thought experiment, it's a lens through which to examine the fundamental questions facing Africa today. Can the continent overcome its divisions and assert its sovereignty on the global stage? Can it build institutions that are both inclusive and effective? Can it harness the energy and aspirations of its youth to drive sustainable development and genuine self-determination? The answers are not simple. The forces of unity and fragmentation are both powerful, and the outcome will depend on the choices made by African leaders, institutions, and citizens. The legacy of Gaddafi's Pan-Africanist vision is both a source of inspiration and a cautionary tale, a reminder of the possibilities and the pitfalls of grand ambitions. As Africa navigates the challenges of the 21st century, the stakes could not be higher. The continent's future will be shaped by its ability to balance the demands of unity and diversity, sovereignty and cooperation, tradition and innovation. The choices made in the coming years will determine whether Africa can realize its potential as a global powerhouse or remain mired in cycles of conflict and dependency. Thank you for joining us on this critical journey. Now, we want to hear from you. What do you see as the strongest force shaping Africa's future sovereignty, accountability, or something else entirely? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's keep this vital conversation going.